I think when we talk about hobbies, there's always a growth as we get older. There's always a line that we can draw between each hobby, like we can find a kind of connection between each one of them, and we can see the growth as they go along, and we can see how each hobby kind of feeds into one another and how they feed into ourself, because what we're interested in ultimately has an impact on who we are as people, and who we are as people also determines what we're interested in. And so when we think about this, I find it very fascinating to look through our hobbies and just how they've changed over time. I've always been into more or less the same things. Like, I used to be into drawing a lot when I was a kid. That was my first, like, real big hobby. And when I got into that, I just wanted to draw everything all the time. And it took me until I was about, I want to say 13, until I really got it out of my head that I was someone who could draw, because my drawings had barely made any progress as I got older. I barely got good at them at all, and as I went on and on and on, I just hated my work even more because I never knew how to draw properly, and I never taught myself how to draw properly. It felt as if there was just some disconnect between me and the paper, and so I never really got into it. But I used to just draw for hours all the time. Any idea that I would come up with, any story concept that I had, I would always immediately throw it onto paper. And I did the same with writing a lot of the time. I've been into writing for years. I wrote several short stories when I was 9 and 10. There's one that was literally called The Land of Fire. I know, unique title, but it had centered around these animal characters who were basically furries, but they were based off of my own pets, because I loved my pets a whole lot. I considered them to be my only friends at the time, so I had cared a lot about just their personalities and, like, who they were in my own head, and so I had put them into this story that I was writing, and I continued to do that for a lot of different written stories that I did. I wanted to be a fiction author for a little while, just because I thought it was cool. I liked books a lot, so I had done this for a while, and I had kind of gotten out of it just because I was like, okay, don't really know where to go with this. I'm not the best at fiction, because even though I really liked the idea of fiction and I liked books a whole lot, I didn't really read a lot of books just because I never found the time to, and I had only really started reading books when I got to be around the age that I started writing them, because for the longest time I thought books were bad and I couldn't really read the words properly. It only took me until I got into history, the subject history, that I really learned how to read and enjoyed reading. And so I just kind of started from there. Like, one day I just kind of picked up a book and was like, I'm gonna read this, and then I just started reading. And for the longest time it took my parents, hours and hours and hours of trying to just coach me into reading, but I just wouldn't do it. And I had picked up on a lot of things from them reading to me, or from what I was learning in school, but I never applied it. I never used it myself. When I finally used it myself, I did so on history, and that had gotten me really excited towards the idea of reading, so I tried to write fiction for a little while. That was a hobby of mine, but my main hobbies have always been pretty creative, or just involved within art. Like, those few ones when I was little were really the only ones. I used to like fishing when I was younger, but I didn't really do it that often. I just did it with my brother because it was one of the few, like, nice times that I actually had with him, and I had just cherished that. I think I was less interested in the act of fishing itself and more interested in trying to have a good time with him, because I almost never did, and I wanted to connect with him. So a lot of my hobbies have always just been staying inside and being creative, so to speak. But the one that I've always had for as long as I can remember, is video games. Now, when I was younger, I've always looked up to people who played a lot of video games and knew a lot about video games from the youngest possible age, because my dad is huge into video games himself, and my brother was as well, and they were always around. I was always inundated with them as a kid, so when you're surrounded by this form of media and the people who you look up to have it in their home, then you begin to also be influenced by that media. And that was very much the case with me. You know, as a 2-year-old, I was playing Halo, I was playing Sonic Adventure, I was playing, what was that fucking game? Seaman on the Dreamcast. And, like, all of these Xbox, you know, PS2, Dreamcast, GameCube games, really loved the Mario Party games on the GameCube. There was just all kinds of stuff, and I was playing a lot of really mature stuff for my age. Like, I played Halo at 2, I played Halo at 3. Like, I've played these very violent video games at a very young age, and I've just always been deeply invested in them. Like, video games has been one of the only things that I cared about for as long as I can remember. As I've gotten older, I've gotten more into other hobbies, and I've actually moved away from video games a little bit, but it's always been there for me. It's always been something I've had, and I've always been deeply obsessed with it on so many levels. Like, when I got a bit older, I got into retro video game collecting. That was a new thing. It's kind of like a sub-hobby. Video gaming was just the main one, but I found out about old video games from this website, JJ Games and GameFAQs. So I went to both of these websites, and I just kind of found them one after another on my Windows ME computer with Internet Explorer, and I went to these websites, and I had found out about all these consoles that I never heard about, and I was like 9, 10, 8. I think I was 8 at the time, because I got my Sega Genesis when I was like 8. I don't remember, but I was pretty young nonetheless, and so I was on the computer just constantly looking at stuff about video games, and that also kind of got me more into reading about video games. And I had just gotten way into the culture of video games and just stuff about them in general, and that was super big for me for the longest time, was collecting old video games and just studying them. I did that from an insanely early age, and later on I got into like watching people's collection videos on YouTube and stuff, but YouTube is one I want to talk about in a little bit. So I had gotten way into video games in terms of the historical aspect. That was new for me, categorizing video games in terms of their history, and I'm still into that, but I got into that, you know, around that age of like 8, and I just started collecting all these different ones, you know, Nintendo 64, things like that. I've always just had a deep fascination with old media that has a lo-fi aesthetic or a VHS quality, and I've never really been able to pinpoint why. It's just always been something that's been the case for me. I've always loved media that takes on VHS, that takes on AV, that takes on a CRT. Things that just feel very grainy in nature. I suppose maybe it was because I grew up with VHS tapes and it reminds me of my childhood. I associate that comfort with that aesthetic because when I was younger, I was surrounded by that aesthetic. Everything we ever owned was, you know, 10 years past its sale date because we couldn't afford anything better. So I was always stuck with using the hand-me-downs, you know. So, in any case, I've always loved old media, and that's been one of my biggest obsessions, one of my biggest hobbies for as long as I can remember, is like antique collecting when it comes to video games. So those have always been the biggest hobbies for me, is video games and drawing and writing. Those were the things that I've always been into. I haven't really had any other hobbies. Like, those have always been the main ones, and I was never interested in anything else, just those things. I kind of watched cartoons and was into cartoons here and there, but it was nowhere near as big for me as video games were. Video games were always like the main thing. Yeah, hobbies. And then I got into YouTube, which was a big thing, obviously. You know, 2014, getting into it with Minecraft videos, and then moving on into 2015 with my old videos that you can still find within my playlist of doing like videos on video games and stuff, old video games, etc. And making videos turned out to be the thing that was my hobby forever. You know, this is the thing that I do the most now. Haven't clocked in as many hours as I have on video games, but one of these days I'm gonna get pretty damn close. So this has always been the biggest thing for me since I had turned 12, essentially, or not turned 12, been 12. This has been my fucking cash cow. As a 16-year-old now, this is the thing that I do all the time and think about all the time. I got really into watching YouTube at 12 as well, with things like Classic Game Room and The Angry Video Game Nerd. Standard, you know, video game reviewers and things like that I was really, really into. And I can still go back to a lot of those people and look back with fondness and charm, especially CGR Undertow, Derek. That guy was just great. Like, he put so much creativity into his game reviews. He's such a good boy. But yeah, this is more or less the chain of events. I have never been into very many things, not like a density of things. I got into metal music for a while. That was a big hobby of mine. When I was like 13, I was super into metal, like black metal, speed metal, thrash metal, death metal, grindcore, all kinds of things, like the really heavy stuff. I was just super deeply invested into every single aspect of metal, and I would just go on Metal Archives and Wikipedia and shit and just search for documentaries or just anything I could get my hands on, and I would listen to every album I could find and the most obscure stuff I could possibly find, and I was super deeply invested. So that was a big hobby of mine for a while, was music, metal music specifically. But nowadays I'm just kind of into whatever. Like, I don't specify by specific genres. I'm more into hip-hop now than I ever was into metal. Like, I really love hip-hop a lot. I love R&B, music from Jamaica, like Gregory Isaacs and Bob Marley and shit. You know, just a higher density of things, not just the same thing over and over again as I was with metal, because once you get deeply into metal, you kind of realize that most of it is just the same. So it gets kind of boring after a while. But with hip-hop, there's just so much more stuff happening all the time. There's so many new things happening. And I mean, I do get kind of used to the whole trap sound. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I really love, you know, popular trap music like Lil Yachty and Migos and Future and, you know, all those guys, Ski Mask and all that. But, like, that stuff is just, it feels good. It feels good to listen to. There's a lot of things that I listen to nowadays that feel good in a way that really cannot compare to metal, just because metal, like, it was there for me at the time. It's what I needed at the time. But a lot of that stuff, when I go back to it, it's just, yeah, this is what 13-year-old me would have liked, but I'm 16 now. I have different interests. So I still like a lot of metal albums. Like Ask by Burzum is on my album chart. It's one of my favorite records. A lot of black metal is still really good, but I don't know, man. I just don't care about it on the deep level that I used to. That's a hobby I kind of fell out of. Mostly my hobbies have always just consisted of consuming media and isolating myself. I'm a huge isolationist person. I've always stayed in my room. I've never really talked to many people. My hobbies are usually just involving me.